I never should have gone. It was just a few days after I got the email from an old buddy of mine, Matt. He had been living in this small, remote town in the middle of nowhere, an off-the-map place called Gray Hollow. You should visit, he wrote. It's quiet here. No one bothers you. I'll show you around the woods, get you out of the city grind for a bit. Trust me, you'll need it. I was burnt out, work, personal stuff, all the usual grind. So I packed my bags, booked a flight to the nearest airport, and took a long drive to Gray Hollow. The moment I arrived, something felt wrong. The air was thick, almost like the sky was always on the edge of a storm. The town had a strange emptiness to it, like people only existed there because they had nowhere else to go. Matt was waiting for me at the edge of the dirt road. He looked different, like he hadn't seen daylight in months. His hair was unkempt, and there were dark bags under his eyes. He gave me a half smile when he saw me, but there was a look in his eyes that made my skin crawl. You're finally here, he said, his voice almost too calm. Yeah, man, I replied, trying to hide the unease that had started to creep into my chest. This place is quiet. Too quiet, almost. Matt chuckled, but it wasn't a reassuring sound. Yeah. It's just the way it is here. You get used to it. He didn't say anything else and started walking, expecting me to follow. I did, though I wasn't sure what I was walking into. The town felt stuck in time. As we walked through the main street, it was like stepping into an old black and white film. The buildings were weathered, some of them clearly abandoned, but still standing tall, like silent witnesses to things I couldn't even begin to imagine. The occasional rustle of a nearby tree or the distant bark of a dog echoed in the air, but there was no sign of life. It was unsettling. Matt led me down an alley that smelled faintly of decay, and I was hit by the distinct feeling that we were being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The windows of the few houses still standing were covered, the curtains drawn tightly, as if they were hiding something. The whole town felt like a ghost town that had been forgotten by the world. As we walked deeper into the heart of Gray Hollow, Matt finally spoke. You know, people around here don't trust strangers. They think they know something's off, but they can't put their finger on it. They live in their own world. It's better that way. Less noise. That sounds a little too eerie, man, I said, my voice betraying my growing discomfort. He didn't respond, but his silence was louder than anything he could have said. We kept walking, and the unsettling feeling in the pit of my stomach kept growing. I had never been good at trusting my instincts, but something about this place made me want to turn around and leave. I could sense that Matt was hiding something, that he knew more than he was letting on. But I didn't want to push him, after all, he was my friend. Finally, we reached a small cabin at the edge of town. It was tucked away, nearly hidden by thick trees that looked like they hadn't been trimmed in years. The air around the cabin was colder than it should have been, even though it was a warm afternoon. This is my place, Matt said, his voice flat, almost rehearsed. I've been living here for a while now. He opened the door, and the smell hit me first, dust, damp wood, and something else, something sharp, like metal. I hesitated for a moment, but then Matt motioned for me to come in. I stepped over the threshold and immediately felt the weight of something oppressive in the air. The walls were lined with strange, faded photographs, old, black and white shots of the town, people I didn't recognize, and scenes that seemed out of place. One in particular caught my eye, a group of men standing around a fire, their faces obscured by shadows, and behind them, a figure standing in the darkness of the trees. I stared at the photo for a moment too long before Matt cleared his throat. Don't mind those. Just old stuff. Who are they? I asked, trying to push the feeling of dread away. People from a long time ago, he replied, but his voice was too stiff. Nothing worth worrying about. I didn't believe him. But I didn't want to press the issue. Not yet. The inside of Matt's cabin was even stranger than the outside. It felt like time had stopped inside. Old, dusty furniture was scattered around, and there were books stacked in random piles. But it wasn't the disarray that made me uneasy, it was the presence of something I couldn't see. It was like the place was holding its breath. I sat down on a rickety chair by the small fireplace. Matt offered me a drink, but I politely declined, feeling like my throat was too tight to swallow anything. "So, Matt," I started, trying to cut through the tension, "what's really going on around here? This place, it's not like any small town I've ever been to. It feels wrong." Matt's eyes darkened slightly, and for the first time since I arrived, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. He ran his hand through his unkempt hair, a nervous gesture. "You should have stayed away, man. I didn't want you to find out, but since you're here, I'll tell you. I never thought you'd actually come." "What are you talking about?" He sighed deeply, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "It's not just the people, you know. There's something else. Something that's been in this town for generations. It's what keeps everyone here. Keeps them alive. The people, the land, it feeds on fear. The darker it gets, the stronger it gets." I stared at him, trying to piece together what he was saying. "What are you saying? Are you telling me this place is haunted or something?" Matt shook his head, his eyes wide. "No. It's worse than that. This town, it's cursed. People don't just live here. They're part of something. And if you stay too long, it'll come for you. It's already here." I leaned back in the chair, my heart starting to race. This wasn't what I signed up for. "What do you mean, it? What is it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to one of the bookshelves and pulled down an old, dusty tome. It looked ancient, its pages yellowed and brittle, like it could fall apart in your hands. He opened it to a page in the middle, his finger tracing along the lines as he spoke softly, almost like he was reading out a prayer. "There's a ritual, something from long ago. A way to keep the darkness from spreading. The people here, they made a deal long before anyone was born. They feed it. It's part of them now. And if you try to leave, it comes for you. It's already watching." I stood up, my legs shaking. "This is insane. Are you telling me you're in on this? That you're part of some cult or something?" Matt's face twisted into a grimace. "I didn't have a choice. None of us do. I didn't want you here. But now that you're here," he trailed off, his gaze distant. "You're in it now. There's no leaving." I felt my stomach drop. Something inside me screamed that I needed to leave right then and there. But as I turned to walk out the door, I froze. The air had changed. It was heavier now, thick with a presence that seemed to press in from all sides. I turned back to Matt, who was standing still, staring at me. But his eyes, they weren't the same anymore. There was a darkness behind them, a coldness that made my blood run cold. "Matt?" My voice shook. "What's happening?" He didn't answer. Instead, his lips curled into a twisted smile. It wasn't his smile. It was something else. Something that didn't belong. The room seemed to pulse with a low hum, and I could hear something scratching at the windows, something trying to get in. I tried to run, but my legs felt like lead, my feet barely able to move. And then I heard it. A voice. Low and raspy, whispering my name from somewhere deep in the shadows. It wasn't Matt's voice. It was something else. I couldn't breathe. The air in the cabin had thickened to the point where it felt like I was underwater, struggling for air. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but my legs were frozen, weighed down by some invisible force. I could hear it again, the whispering, slithering through the walls like a serpent, its voice dripping with malice. It was calling my name. "Jacob," it hissed, the sound so soft and twisted that it made my skin crawl. "Jacob." My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to Matt, hoping for some explanation, some sign of the person I thought I knew. But his face, contorted into something unnatural, gave me nothing but cold emptiness. His lips parted, and I braced myself for the words that followed. "Don't look outside," he muttered, the words barely audible. His voice sounded strained, as though it wasn't even coming from him. My eyes locked onto the window, and I saw the outline of something huge, just beyond the glass. It was black, so dark that it seemed to swallow the light around it, like a shadow given form. And it was moving. "Matt, what the hell is that?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't respond. He didn't even blink. I couldn't help myself. I moved closer to the window, my body acting against my will, drawn to the figure outside. The darkness seemed to grow thicker, pressing against the glass, as though it were trying to come in. And then, I saw it. A pair of eyes, huge, unblinking, and glowing faintly with an unnatural light. They were set deep into the thing's form, like pits of despair, staring at me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. There was no mistaking it. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. It was something much older, much darker. I stumbled back from the window, my mind spinning. What is that thing? What the hell is it? Matt's voice was barely a rasp. It's the thing that's been here longer than any of us. It's the thing that keeps this town alive. And once you see it, it won't let you go. My blood ran cold. What do you mean it keeps the town alive? Matt, what are you saying? He turned to me slowly, the darkness in his eyes deepening. The people here are bound to it. Every generation. They feed it, keep it satisfied. But it's never enough. It grows hungrier. And now that it's seen you, Jacob, there's no turning back. I shook my head, struggling to comprehend what was happening. This is insane. You're telling me that thing out there is controlling this town? That it needs to feed on people. What does it want from me? It wants you. His voice cracked as he said it. It wants your fear. It wants you to be afraid. And it will never let you leave until it gets what it wants. I felt a surge of panic rise in me, and without thinking, I bolted for the door. But as I reached for the handle, something slammed into the outside of the cabin, shaking the walls. A guttural, bone-chilling growl echoed through the air, and the ground beneath my feet trembled. It wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside, too. I spun around to face Matt. What the hell do I do? How do I get out of here? He didn't answer. Instead, his body convulsed, his eyes rolling back in his head as he collapsed onto the floor. I heard him gasp for air, but it wasn't his voice anymore. It was a deep, guttural noise, like something was choking him from the inside. The darkness outside was closing in, the air growing colder, thicker with each passing second. I felt my lungs tighten as a voice, that same voice, whispered again, only this time it was louder, clearer, and it was no longer just calling my name. Jacob, it whispered, as if it was standing right behind me. You are mine. I turned quickly, my heart racing, my legs shaking. The thing, whatever it was standing right there, its glowing eyes fixed on me. Its shape was enormous, obscured by the darkness, but the way it moved was inhuman, a shifting mass that seemed to twist and distort with every step it took. It was coming for me. I couldn't breathe. The weight of the darkness around me felt like it was suffocating me, crushing me from all sides. The thing, the monster, was standing just a few feet away now, its eyes glowing with an unsettling hunger. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. All I could hear was the frantic pounding of my own heart in my ears. Jacob, the voice was louder now, almost deafening, echoing in my mind. You cannot escape. I turned and bolted for the door, but as I reached for the handle, it slammed shut with a deafening thud. The force sent me stumbling back. I hit the floor hard, my vision spinning, and I looked up to see the shadow growing larger, filling every inch of the cabin. I scrambled to my feet, my body trembling with terror. The thing wasn't moving, but it was watching me, its eyes were unblinking, almost mocking. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get away, but there was nowhere to go. "Matt!" I screamed, my voice finally breaking through the paralyzing fear. "Matt, help me! What the hell is happening?" But Matt was gone. The twisted figure that had once been my friend was no longer in the room. In his place was a lifeless shell, his eyes empty and wide. The shadow behind him, that thing, had swallowed him whole, his body now just another offering to whatever this thing was. The air was suffocating. I felt the walls closing in, and that voice, its voice, echoed again, this time deeper, more sinister. "You cannot hide, Jacob. You belong to me now." The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, like it was alive, and I stumbled, falling to my knees. The darkness was closing in, wrapping around me like a cold, unrelenting embrace. I tried to crawl towards the window, desperate to escape, but as I reached the edge, I felt something cold and slimy grip my ankle. I looked down in horror, only to see dark, writhing tendrils emerging from the floor, like they had been waiting for me, feeding off my fear. They pulled at my skin, dragging me backward, and I screamed, desperate to break free. But it was too late. I felt myself being dragged across the floor, my fingers scraping against the wooden planks as I tried to hold on to something, anything, but nothing was solid. The world around me blurred as I was pulled toward the center of the room, where the shadow loomed larger than ever. It was real. This wasn't a dream. It was a nightmare, but it wasn't ending. It was just beginning. "You were never meant to leave, Jacob," the voice whispered again, closer this time. "You were never meant to walk away from Grey Hollow." In that moment, I realized the truth, the horrifying truth. The people of Grey Hollow had made a pact with this thing. They fed it, kept it alive, kept it satisfied, and in return, it let them live. But the price was always the same. The darkness needed more. It always needed more. And now it had me. I could feel it, feel the pull in my chest, like something inside me was being taken. The air was thick with its presence, and I knew, that there was no escaping. I had stepped into a trap. There was no way out. "Welcome home," the voice purred, a twisted, malicious grin stretching across the darkness. And then, everything went silent. The silence was unbearable. I could feel the oppressive weight of it hanging in the air, the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. But it wasn't just quiet, it was wrong. Every breath I took felt like I was inhaling smoke, something thick and suffocating that burned in my lungs. I tried to move, to scream, but I couldn't. It felt like my body had been paralyzed, held in place by the dark tendrils still wrapped around my limbs. They were pulling at me, but not in a way that made me feel physical pain. Instead, it was like something was being stripped away, like my very soul was being torn from me. The darkness seemed to pulse, a rhythmic thumping that matched the beat of my own heart. And then, out of the silence, came a sound, a low, guttural growl, deep and resonating, vibrating through the very walls of the cabin. Jacob, it wasn't just the voice anymore. It was everywhere, inside my head, crawling into my thoughts, weaving through my memories. It felt like the thing was claiming me, taking ownership of everything I ever was. "You will be part of me," it whispered, the words like a promise, a curse. "Forever." I tried to fight it, tried to scream, but the more I resisted, the harder it got to move. The shadow in front of me grew, stretching toward the ceiling, its form more solid now, more real. It was a grotesque amalgamation of shapes, of twisted limbs, eyes, and teeth that seemed to shift and change, as if it was constantly evolving. I realized something, then, something that twisted my stomach into knots. It had been here for longer than anyone could remember. It had always been here. It had shaped this town, shaped the people, and when they had outlived their usefulness, it had fed on them. It fed on fear, on the life force of anyone who stayed too long. And now, it was feeding on me. But just as I thought I might give in, something happened. A voice, a real one, cut through the darkness. "Jacob." I recognized it immediately. It was Matt's voice, but it wasn't right. It sounded distant, strained, as though it was coming from the farthest corner of my mind. But it was real. I had to believe it was real. "Matt?" I gasped, my voice hoarse, barely able to get the words out. The darkness paused for a moment. Just a brief pause, but in that moment, I felt something shift. The tendrils loosened, just slightly, enough for me to regain a shred of control. I reached out, my hand trembling, grabbing for the nearest object I could find, a dusty, rusted knife that lay discarded on the floor beside me. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Matt, what's happening?" I begged, my voice cracking. "Tell me what I need to do to get out of here." There was a long, agonizing silence before Matt's voice returned, weaker this time, almost pleading. "You need to run. Get out of the town, Jacob. Don't look back. Don't let it take you." I could hear the desperation in his words, and the realization hit me hard. The thing, the shadow, had taken him. It had claimed him long ago. He wasn't just warning me, he was trying to save me from the same fate. But it was too late. I could feel the cold fingers of the darkness creeping into my chest, wrapping around my heart. The growl grew louder, and the air grew colder still. I didn't have time to think. There was no escape, no running from something like this. The more I struggled, the tighter its grip became. In a final act of desperation, I raised the knife and lunged toward the darkness, hoping against hope that somehow, I could cut through it. The knife sank deep into something, but it wasn't flesh. It was like stabbing into thick, suffocating fog. And then everything stopped. The shadow froze, its form trembling, and the growl turned into something far worse, a screech, a noise that shredded the silence, that tore into my ears. I felt my vision go black, and in that instant, the weight of the darkness crushed me entirely. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was hearing Matt's voice once more, whispering softly in my ear, "I'm sorry. You were never meant to leave." I was gone. There was no escaping what had happened in Grey Hollow. I became another nameless soul, lost to the shadow that had devoured countless others before me. But somehow, some part of me, maybe the part still holding on to the desperate hope that someone would hear my story, was able to resist the darkness. And now, I'm here, trying to piece together what happened, trying to make sense of it all. It's been months since I last set foot in that godforsaken town. But something has followed me. I feel it creeping in the edges of my vision when I'm alone at night, a presence that I can't shake. It waits for me, just like it waited for the others before me. I can hear the whispers, just faintly, like distant voices calling from deep inside the earth. "Jacob," it's there again, a low rasp that sends chills down my spine. It never stops. I thought I could leave. I thought once I was away from Grey Hollow, I could forget about it, about them. But I was wrong. The thing in the shadow, the thing that controls everything in that cursed town, doesn't let go so easily. Once it knows you, once you've seen it, it owns you. I'm not the same anymore. I see the darkness everywhere. It's in the reflections of windows at night, in the way the shadows stretch too long in the corners of rooms. It's always watching. Always waiting. I hear the voices of the others, the ones who came before me, who are still trapped in Grey Hollow, still feeding the hunger that never ceases. Matt's voice is the clearest. He calls to me, begging me to understand, to know that there's no way out once you're chosen. "Jacob, please," his voice cracks. "You were never meant to leave." Sometimes, when I'm alone, I can feel the cold fingers of that darkness wrap around my throat. It's as if it's reaching out through the air, pulling me closer to the edge of madness. I'm afraid I won't last much longer. But worst of all, I know that it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. The shadow has tasted my fear, and it's not done yet. Grey Hollow still waits for me. And when the time comes, it will come for me, just like it came for Matt, for everyone else. And there will be no escape.